Being able to interact with APIs is very important. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the steps of interacting with APIs in Python. So Python is a good language for working with APIs because it's very well known, has a large community, and is very easy to set up and use. But even though I'll be using Python in this video, just know that the principles apply to any language or tool that you can use to send API requests. So to begin, you'll need access to Python. I'm going to do everything on my local computer, and if you want to do the same thing, you can just download and install Python according to the instructions. But there are also websites you can go to where you can write Python in the browser, so you can use that as well. So let me go over to my text editor, Visual Studio Code, and I'll set up a Python virtual environment. So the reason why I need a Python virtual environment is simply so I can install the dependencies for this project and keep it separate from the dependencies from all the other projects I have on my computer. So to do that on the command line, I'll just do python3-m venv and then env. So this simply creates a virtual environment, the place where the dependencies gets installed. It's called env. It's this directory over here. And then I'll start it up by doing source bin activate. And once again, this may vary depending on the operating system that you're using, but the overall idea is the same when it comes to creating these virtual environments. So I have the virtual environment active, as you can see on the left-hand side with env here. So with a virtual environment active, I can install the one dependency I need, which is the library called requests. So I can do pip install requests here, and that will go ahead and install it into my virtual environment. So that's the only dependency that I need. So now let me create a file so I can write all the code to send these API requests. I'll just call this script.py, but of course the name doesn't matter in this case. And what I need to do at the top of this file is import that library that I just installed. So requests, so import requests here. Okay, so now that I've imported this library, I want to start using it. So the simplest thing that I can do is I can send a GET request to some website out there. So I'll do requests. This is how it starts. And then the method that you want. So the method that we are going to use here is a GET request. So request.get, and then the URL of the API or the website that we're requesting. So let me try Google. So I'll put in the address for Google, and I'll just run this file by typing Python and then script.py. So as we can see, nothing happened or nothing seemingly happened. And the reason is because I only sent the request, but I didn't do anything with the response. So to do this, to get the response, what you can do is you can assign the return value of this call request.get to a variable called response, and then you can print it. So response, and I'll do response.text because that contains the most important part of the response. So I'll run the script again, and now we see all this here appears in my console. And if you look closely, it's a bunch of Google stuff. So this is basically the HTML for the Google homepage. So this isn't very useful to call, but this is the approach that you use when you're calling any API. So now let's go to an actual API. I have the documentation up for this API called REST countries. And here they give you this endpoint. So I'll just copy this restcountries.com/v3.1/all. And I'll put this in here. And then I'll send the request by running the script. And now when I look at it, I see a bunch of data about the countries in the world. So the idea behind this API is you can call it and get information about any country in the world, things like the population, the borders, the time zone, the flag, and so on. Any information that you want about a country, the goal of this API is to just give you that information. So right now we're viewing the response as text down here. But oftentimes API responses are given in the JSON format, which is a lot easier to work with in programming languages. So the request library can convert any response into the Python equivalent of JSON, which is basically Python dictionaries and Python lists, which are very easy to work with. So to do that, you simply call .json on the response instead of .text, and you need to have these parentheses on the end. So now I'll call this again. And you may notice it looks pretty much the same. And that's because the data is the same, but the format is different. Now that it's in the JSON format or Python dictionaries and lists, I can go through it and get exactly what I want. Because there's so much data, I want to just get the data that I'm interested in. So let's say I want to send a request to get just the data for Brazil. So let me go over to the documentation. And here, if you find where it says name, it allows me to search for a country using the name of that country. So I'll copy this URL here and I'll paste it in. So instead of getting all, I'll just get Brazil. And now I'll send the request again. So let me scroll all the way down and call python.script again. And now we see I get less information and it is relevant to only Brazil. So I don't see the other countries anymore, only Brazil. So here I can drill down into the response. So first I see that there's a list. So I want the first thing in the list. And then I can go to name. So here I'm looking at name, which is a dictionary. And then inside of there, I can get the official name. So official. So let me go ahead and send this again. And now we see just the official name of the country. I'm no longer getting all of this because I was able to drill down into the data that I wanted exactly because I called .json on the response. If this were text still, this would not work because it's just text and you can't drill down into text in the same way that you can drill down into JSON. So that was a GET request, which is conventionally used when we just want to retrieve data from an API. But what if we want to send some data to an API or have the API perform some action for us? Then we want to send a post request. So what I'll do is I'll just comment out this and I'll start a new request. So it's going to return response in the request.post, and then I need an API endpoint. So for this one, I'm going to use the Open API. And here I just want to use the chat functionality. So here I'm going to go to this create chat completions API endpoint and copy it and paste it in here. And typically with post requests, we need to send some data along with it. So in this particular case, I want to send a prompt to the API so it can give me an answer. So here in the documentation, it's a little bit difficult to figure out what to grab exactly. But in this case, I'll copy this part here. And I'll put it in a variable called data. So it's easier to see and so I can modify it. So the idea behind this is I'm calling a model, one of their AI models, and then I'll have some messages. First is the system prompt, which just says it's a helpful assistant. And then the second one is some users. So I'm going to send a question. What is a REST API? Okay, so I'm going to ask their AI, what is a REST API? And then I want to send this data to the API. So to do that, it depends on the data format that they expect. In this case, they expect JSON. So what I can do is after the URL, I'll add a comma and then do JSON equals data. So I'm going to send all this data here, including the question that I asked, to this API. So let's go ahead and do print response.text and let's see what happens. And we see here, you didn't provide an API key is the message. So typically when you're using post requests, you have to have an account with the system because you're going to be performing some action or changing some data somewhere. So once you create an account, typically you'll get an API key. There are different forms of authentication, but typically it's an API key. And in the documentation, they just talk about what you need to do. So here, what you need to do is send a request with the authorization header, followed by bearer and then the OpenAI API key. So let's do that. So here I can create a dictionary in Python called headers. And the header that I want to send is authorization. So I'll type that here. And then the value is going to be the word bearer followed by a space and then your API key. So this is my API key for OpenAI. And then to send that along with the requests, I'll just do headers equals headers. So the headers are separate from the data. The headers represent just general information that you would send to multiple endpoints, whereas the data represents what you want to send to this particular endpoint. So I'm asking the chat to perform a completion on this question. So I need the data here, but this headers will apply to any endpoint that I call. So now let me go ahead and run this. And we see here, I get a response. And then we see the response here. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. A REST API is an architectural style for designing networked applications and so on. So it gives you the completion here based off the question. If I ask a different question, can I use Python to send API requests? and do that again. And actually, before I do it, let me go ahead and convert this to JSON and then drill down into just the answer, right? So here it's a dictionary, and here we have choices. So I'm going to put choices here. Choices is a list. I want the first thing in the list. That list has a dictionary with message as the key that has the content, and then message has another dictionary called content. Okay, so now let me send this and it will just give me the response. And then this is the answer to the question, can I use Python to send API requests? It says, yes, you can absolutely use Python to send API requests, and so on. So this was a simple example of sending post requests, but as you can see, it's very similar to sending GET requests, except you just need to add the data that you want to send along with a header if necessary that has your authentication information. So now that you've seen the basics of sending API requests in Python, you can try for yourself in the exercises that follow this lecture.